Betting, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Bet with the Best podcast. Its mission is to explore better ways to bet on races, to seek out new, successful players, and to boldly go where no podcast has gone before.
The Bet with the Best podcast is sponsored by Amwager, an ADW built by horse players for horse players. Speed, power, and ease of use are at the core of Amwager. The platform is packed with features including live video, race replays, conditional wagering, and true odds, a predictive estimate of the off odds that will give you an edge. Amwager gives players the information and tools they need to quickly make anything from a win bet to a complex structured group of pick 5 tickets using the ABC strategy. With a rating of over 4.5 stars on Google, Amwager is a favorite among horse players. Sign up now at amwager.com to take advantage of the simplest sign-up bonus in the business, a 100% first deposit match up to $150. If you want to bet with the best, then you need an edge. You need Amwager.
Welcome to episode 51 of the Bet with the Best podcast. Once again, joining us on the show is Marshall Gramm for part 2 of our discussion on CAWs. Welcome back to the show, Marshall.
Yeah, and thanks for having me on. Looking forward to offering some solutions to these to this CAW issue.
Yeah, we try to kind of characterize, the evolution of the teams and what models were and how they become successful, and then what the impacts of that success are, kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly of the teams. So now, given where we are, we want to talk about what can we do to better manage the teams, and what can, from an industry standpoint, and then what can players do to compete? I mean, how can you, given the realities of, what you're up against today, get past the whining and complaining, and, and hopefully, just rather than just quitting and moving on, can you compete? And if so, what can you do to be more successful? So that's what we're going to try to cover now. But let's start out with, you mentioned it a little bit, but maybe go in a little more detail about some examples where tracks have made at least some small attempt to kind of manage the CAW involvement in their pools and kind of mitigate some of the negative impacts that we talked about. Maybe characterize what you're aware of that has been done and how successful or unsuccessful that's been. And then we'll kind of talk about what we think should be done, beyond that.
So the most promising things that have been done, in my opinion, are NYRA and Del Mar's limitation of the teams in the win pool. The teams have to bet, I think, either 2 or 3 minutes to post, and that has effectively corralled the odds fluctuations in those pools. There's still some, but they're not as dramatic as they have been in the past. At those tracks right now, 3 to 5% of money 3 to 5 to 8% of money comes in the last cycle. That's much less than previously. For Del Mar, it was 15%, and the national numbers, I think, are around 25% in the win pool. And there's not the big changes as well. So to me, that's a great start. I think people, some people who are maybe more angry and bitter about this thought Del Mar did too little. I actually think I think to me, this is the biggest step, right? Is limiting their access to the win pool. It's our most visual pool, and the one that is the gateway to other pools. Then NYRA also restricts the teams from playing the late pick 5 and the pick 6. The teams aren't in the Grand Slam, and I don't think are in the cross country wagers either. And so I think those are helpful. The differences between the early pick 5 and the late pick 5 gives us some indication of team size, which is why I wrote that little paper that was written about in the TDN is because of the limitation in the late pick 5 and the fact that teams are in the early pick 5, we can get a sense of the size of the teams, right? I really, that article is not meant to single out NYRA. And not meant to sort of criticize them. It's really meant to use their data to show how big the teams are and how much they're growing, especially in terms of these multi-race wagers. It wasn't that long ago where the teams focused almost exclusively on vertical wagers, and now they're heavily involved in the horizontals as well. So, having some of these recreational player only pools, these non-CAW player pools are also really helpful. And so that's I think that's what I'm aware of is being done at the track level. What I would like to see.
Wait, hold on before you move on. I just wanted to kind of follow up a little bit on the NIRA Pick Five study. What was the difference? I mean, how much more money was going into the late Pick Five? I mean, the early Pick Five where the CAWs could, how much late money was coming in there versus in the late Pick Five where they weren't supposedly playing? What was the difference?
So one thing that sort of fuzzied up my study was the fact that NIRA changed tote providers in the middle of the study. And so as a result, they went to a longer tote cycle, which is bizarre. You would think that talk about technology moving in the wrong direction. They went from a 10-second to a 30-second tote cycle in the fall of 2023. But it's still an apples to apples comparison to look at the early to late pick five over that time frame. So in this most recent in 2025, in the late pick five, about 9% of the money comes in the last cycle, and in the early pick five, about 29% comes in the last cycle. Okay, so that's 9% late pick five, 29% early pick five. So what does that mean? 20% of the money is likely from the teams, because that's the only difference, right? That's the only difference that exists between the early pick five and the late pick five, with the exception, I guess, that you get a little bit of a look into the first race in the late pick five because of the doubles. That's the only difference. I'm not sure why that would drive last cycle handle. So a 20% is a good estimate for the size of the size difference, and that difference was much less in 3 years ago. 3 years ago, it looks like it was 4% and 13%, so about a 9% difference in 2022 versus a 20% difference now. So in percentage terms, that's more than a doubling of the size of the team's involvement in the early pick five.
Yeah, that was a great example of what you economists love to do, is try to find some natural experiment, where just because of circumstances, in this case, NIRA shutting the teams out in the late one, but letting them in the early one, you had sort of a natural experiment to see what the difference was where they're allowed in and where they're allowed out. And you could kind of infer their impact.
Yeah, and
probably reliable.
Exactly. Yeah, no, it's perfect. I mean, and so that was the whole point. And it's hard to get. That's really more of a two paragraph. Hard to get and I wouldn't even call it hard to get a policy piece out of two paragraphs. So I decided to dig deep into the NIRA data, because our NIRA data is really good, and kind of look at the other pools as well. But that to me is the key. The fact that what we're seeing in the late pick five versus the early pick five, indicating the size of the teams. Because everything that we've talked about with the size of the teams, we just don't know, because no one says anything. We have some ideas. Pat had put out some policy pieces of the TIF that had how much the teams had wagered on certain days, right? But we don't have a clear measure, and this I think is as good as any.
And that's really frustrating. It's got to be frustrating for someone like you that likes to look at the data. There's no reason why we couldn't have that data. At least the breakout between what's coming from the licensed CAWs versus everybody else, and the fact that tracks just aren't willing to show that and track that, and it's just, to me, it's really frustrating. But it's got to be more so for you, who would like to look at those numbers and help figure out what's the right policy. It just seems crazy.
Yes and no. I mean, interesting. I mean, what bothers me about the teams is like I said on the previous episode, is the fact that is this late money flows, right? So I'm not as concerned about how big they are, outside of the fact that they have a huge pricing difference, and that they adjust the prices. And so if we saw both of those, I'm not as bothered by them. I
I
think that
guess, but if you're trying to make the case for why it's imperative that we solve that problem, and you don't understand how much retail handle is really cratering, to me, if we actually had that data, we might be able to get people's attention more when they see that, how much of the money is actually, is from these teams and how that's not sustainable. I just think you can make a better case for a policy change when it's all shrouded in secrecy and you're just guessing. You have no idea. Maybe they think this could go on forever, which I don't really think is true. But without the data, it's hard to make that case, right?
well, I do think there's too much of a discussion on how big the team should be, and I don't know if there's a right answer to that, right? Because it's really that discussion really only matters based upon how much they're extracting from the pools, right? And the fact that they win is not an issue because there are always going to be winners and losers in this ecosystem. And it's important to also understand they devote a lot of resources to this. These teams have, like dozens of people working on them, trip handicapping, programmers, data analysts. I mean, these are really professionally done. But my issue with them is the unfair price advantage and the price discovery. But that's sort of a different argument, right? And in either way, whether I know it or not, or whether the public knows it or not, I hope that the industry does. And I'm not so certain the industry knows it because there's not been enough discussion on these late money movements, and I don't know how much, in some ways, shouldn't the people in the industry be putting out these numbers? I mean,
yeah, no, that's what I mean. That's what I'm saying. Without the data, it's hard to make informed decisions, right? It's just that's my frustration. It's all guessing, and it doesn't have to be. That's where I'm frustrated. But I do want to come back to the Del Mar thing because to me that was exceptional. I mean, in my own experience in the racing, I have seldom, if ever, seen racetrack management take that significant of action that quickly to respond to an issue. It was pretty much unprecedented the way Del Mar reacted to the outcry and actually made a substantial change. Now, they could, of course, make a whole bunch of other changes. We're going to talk about that, but they actually made a significant change very quickly, which just, within a week, which just shocked me, and I was just really surprised. So I want to applaud them for that. That's something you just don't see in this industry very often, if ever.
No, I agree 100%, and I think that hopefully I encourage people to respond by betting in the win pool. And the other thing, anyway, I encourage that response, right? Bet in the win pool, support Del Mar. I know that many of us think this is not enough, but to me, this is a huge step, and probably the biggest step in the right direction is following NYRA's lead in terms of what they're doing. And look, the NYRA win pool is about to get better because after Saratoga ends, they're going to have penny breakage. So you're going to have no teams in the win pool in NYRA, and you're going to get penny breakage. So support these pools. And if you see crazy exacta prices, understand those crazy exacta prices are a result of the teams not being in the win pool, right? And so
yeah, that's a good point because people have kind of been going insane when they look at in the past. They would kind of estimate what you would expect an exacta to be based on the win prices. And they see these examples where they're completely out of whack, right? They don't make sense. And they complain that, the teams are killing the exacta pools. Well, they might want to just be glad that they can actually play in a pool where the teams aren't killing them, right? But they're looking at it the exact opposite way. And that's a great example of how the teams work. In fact, some of them initially, and this probably has changed, but some of those teams, that's all they did was look across pools for, inefficiencies and bet into those to average it out. That was their main strategy. Now they probably don't have those teams anymore. I mean, they're all looking across pools, but they're probably a lot more efficient than they used to be. But there was a time where that was, a major strategy for some of these teams. They weren't even using a logic model, regressing, on a handicapping model. They were just going across pools and, basically trading across the pools.
Well, one of the early handicapping books I read is a book called Beat the Racetrack by Bill Ziemba. And the late Bill Ziemba, and I got a chance to get to know him, but that was basically using the win pool to using win pool prices to arbitrage the place and chill pool. And he had this whole system written out with estimates to where you could stand at the window, watch the win odds, and bet the place and show. And effectively, that was like an early system that would ultimately change prices in the place and chill pool. Now that is long gone, right? In fact, if you now see situations where the place and show pool don't align with the win pool, it typically means that's a horse that's either going to win or run out. And often I tend to view it as a very negative sign, because the horses that are bet like that are no longer, are bet like that are no longer good place or show plays. So it's just interesting that was probably the starting point for a lot of teams arbing these different pools, and now it's gotten much more complicated.
Yeah, I know for a fact that there were teams that was just that's what they did. They used the computer power to be able to do that in a way humans could. He talked about systems that approximate it, but they were doing a little more, using the computer to their advantage. But that just shows you how, again, you could look at exacta prices versus the win pool and do a similar study to what you did with the pick five. You got to be able to kind of get an estimate of, how much more the teams are in those exacta prices than they are or exacta pools than they are in the win pool.
Yeah, but the only thing I would caution is, and I did this for Naira, right? I mean, the in 2025. So here are the numbers from 2025. The win pool 16.8% in the last cycle. The exacta 44.3%, trifecta 47.6%, superfecta 50.9%. But the only thing that I would caution against that is it's not quite apples to apples, right? Because teams may be more involved in those pools even under a non-restrictive scenario, right? So they may bet more into those pools anyway. So it's not as clear as the early pick five, late pick five. But yeah, I mean there's clearly a lot of late money. I mean, over half the money comes in that last cycle in the superfecta pool.
Yeah, and you figure that's probably not human players making, all these precise bets. It's probably the computers that are flooding those last second combinations. All right, so anything else being done outside of Naira or Del Mar that you're aware of, or is that pretty much it? And doesn't Santa Anita do something?
So I believe there are restrictions at the Stronach tracks. They do some limitations, but I'm less sure of them, and I see less evidence of it in the data. There's still price movements, right? But I do believe that there's some Stronach group restrictions. I just don't know. I don't know exactly what they are, and they're less visible in the data, right? Is what's clearly happening at Del Mar and Santa Anita. I do hear a lot more discussion about this, and so I'm hopeful that we will see more. More recreational player only pools or more restrictions in the visible pools.
All right, so let's move on then. Okay, so if you could influence policy within the industry, what are the changes that you'd advocate for making to try to better manage the situation?
So I would try to throttle the teams down. And have the same restrictions that I have in the win pool in all visible pools. So I'd throttle them down in the win, play, show, exacta, and double pool. I mean, these are our pools that people look at and they see the odds and they see the odds fluctuations. And so the ones that are visible, I would throttle them down in. So that would be one of the first things I would change.
So throttle them down by not doing what they've done in the win pool, they can't.
Yeah, no, I would do what I did in the win pool. I would limit them. This is my idealized world, right? And so, in my idealized world, I would make it so that in these pools, that the teams or the team or batch bettors would have to bet within 2 minutes to post. And so maybe I'd make this broadly. Maybe I would make it so that if you did batch betting, right, whether it be whether your team or whether you did file upload, that if you bet into the visible pools, that you are limited in doing your batch bets up to 2 minutes to post. So that if you want to play the exacta or double under 2 minutes to post, you've got to key it in by hand like anyone else at their computer, and so that would be a restriction both on teams and on smaller under the radar teams and people doing file upload. Now, clearly, someone can still move the number, right? You can still bet big, 3 or 4 big exacta combinations by hand, but so be it. So that's what that would be my restriction, is to eliminate batch betting in the visible pools at 2 minutes to post. Okay, and then I would equalize batch betting across all horse players, meaning that there shouldn't be a difference between what the teams are able to do and what a recreational or what a non-team is able to do. So I would eliminate any sort of 3 seconds per bet restriction. If you're uploading a big Excel file of pick 6 bets, you may have an Excel file. I had an Excel file that would create like 180 different combinations based upon how I rank ordered by ticket. And I know other people who have Excel spreadsheets do the same based upon probabilities they enter, right? But those tickets, if you upload all these different combinations, they take a while to cycle through because of 3 bets per second throughput. I would equalize it across the teams and all individuals. Every individual should be able to upload at the same speed. And it's just we should remove that batch betting opportunity in the visible pools at 2 minutes to post. And so I would make those 2 changes as far as the visible pools are concerned. I would also, I'd figure out how to lower the price differences between the teams and recreational players, whether it means raising the price the teams play and or lowering the price recreational players. I'd like to see a little bit of both, right? I think the teams should not pay anything less than the host fee. There should be no deals cut to where a team's dollar to the host track is any different than a regular player's dollar, right? Than a professional player, regular player's dollar. So they should not pay less than the host fee, right? They should still get their rebates, but they should get no substantially larger rebates than any other high volume professional player. There should not be any deals cut below the host fee. And then I'd like to see overall takeout fall, and I'd especially like to see takeout fall in exotics. I don't understand if the host fee is flat, right? If tracks get a 10% or 8% or 5% host fee, and that's flat across all wagers, then I don't understand the tiered exotic takeouts, right? To where some tracks have a 30% takeout on trifectas, and a professional player or team gets rebated 18 to 22%, and a recreational player gets 0%. So I'd have basically a flat all across the board takeout. So maybe that number is 17%, 19%. I'd love to see it lower, right? I'd love to see, 15%, 13%, but whatever it is, I don't see why it's not equalized across all pools.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So let me kind of summarize what you're suggesting. First of all, restrict any sort of batch processing has to be completed before 2 minutes to post. And I think that's important to emphasize how that's so much better than just closing the windows at 2 minutes to post. Because if we just closed the windows at 2 minutes to post, it will solve the problem of the odds changing during the race, but it still gives those teams that huge pricing advantage because they get to see the last prices. It's just now they're seeing them 2 minutes before post, but they're seeing them after everybody else has bet, and then they can bet into those. So you're still going to have late changes after the players have been able to bet. It's just you'll see them show up on the board before the race starts rather than during the race. So that solves the visibility problem, the integrity, lack of integrity problem, but it doesn't really reduce the advantage the teams have. But what you're suggesting is actually the opposite effect, in that it would actually improve price discovery for players, because now all those batch wagers are in, and they all have a good idea of what the price is going to be, better than the teams themselves. Although with their models, it probably won't be that much better, but as good as, probably. And you also have, stop the late odds changes during the race. So I really like your idea of cutting it off for batch wagering rather than cutting it off for everybody. Would you agree with that? And is that kind of what you were thinking with that?
Yes. So a couple things to clarify, and I think are important. So everyone's talked about having like a shot clock, or stopping betting at 1 minute to post. So that doesn't solve the price drops, and we'll still see the price drops. And so I don't know if is it like what it solves is concerns that that there's past posting going on, and I don't I don't believe there is. I don't, I would hope there isn't. I mean, certainly nothing would surprise me in this game, but there probably isn't. But it would allay those fears. But it doesn't, we're going to still see drops. And so I don't know if we see a horse drop from 18-1 to 16-1. I still think there'd be a lot of what the hell's going on with that. The other part is that I just don't know, how do we solve it? How do we solve, if we stop everything at 0 minutes to post, what happens if there's a gate scratch? What happens if a horse busts through the gate? What happens if a horse acts up into the gate? I like as a recreational player, even, or whatever you would call me, weekend warrior, semi-professional. I like being able to cancel my bet if a horse breaks through the gate. I like being able to recalibrate my bets if there's a late scratch. So I'm not sure that I would stop everything at 0 minutes to post, right? Without some clear way that they're going to deal with gate issues and gate scratches, because I think that opens up a can of worms. I've not heard anyone talk about that.
Yeah, I agree, but I also really like the idea that it helps with price discovery for players, because I like the shutting it off of the batch wagering early, so they don't they don't have that advantage of waiting to see all the prices and making the bets. So, I mean, to me, your solution is much, much better than just closing the windows to everybody.
And look, I'm okay with everybody batch wagering up until the gun in the non-visible pools. That maybe is a controversial take, and I'd be willing. Look, if it were one or the other, and we had to cut everyone from batch betting at 2 minutes to post, that's fine by me as well. I guess I'm willing to let the teams have their own pools that they feast in, and I would know to avoid those, right? And maybe they do. Maybe they have different rules for pools that are very similar. Like maybe there's a different rule for the super than there is with the trifecta. I don't know, but to me, the non-visible pools, they can knock themselves out for all I care, right?
So let me ask you a question on that. I just don't know how the Tote system works, but couldn't from giving players price discovery information, can't you pull information out all the pools in kind of a net pricing thing, where you look at all the bets in the superfecta that had this horse on top, and all the bets in the trifecta that had this horse on top, and all the and the exactas with this horse on top, and the win pool, and the doubles, and the pick threes? Can't you just take all that money and aggregate it to get a sense for what the price is on a horse? And if you could, that's question one, then wouldn't it still be good to cut off that batch access then? Because that still is pricing information that could be useful to players. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but
yeah, I mean, I guess the answer to that is yes and yes. If we want to put everyone on the same level playing field, right, and basically eliminate the key component of what the teams do, right, then you can eliminate batch betting in all pools. So if we want to eliminate if their big component of what they do was the look in, right? The fact that they get a sense of the public's odds and then they're late movers. If we want to eliminate that from every pool, then we can eliminate batch betting. Um, even for what you're saying, there is that information is there. Now it's not necessarily publicly available, but I think it should be. Back to other prescriptions for what can help recreational players is, we just need better odds discovery, right? And I'm looking at the Tote board and seeing the odds, but we should have imputed doubles up. We should have imputed pick threes. The teams avoid the doubles now, so the doubles become less predictive, right? Because teams avoid the doubles because it reveals their hand, because it's a public pool and you can take the whole matrix. But the pick threes have become a place where the teams play significantly, and the pick threes can be very predictive. We only get one line of the pick three wager, right? We only get the final will pay. That's only represents one part of that large matrix. But I know that large matrix is out there. And so there's no reason the Tote can't display that and can't help price discovery for the third race on. And then, like you're saying, with the amount on the top of trifectas or superfectas, Sanford Orlando Greyhound used to display the trifecta combinations, the dog that was on the top of the trifecta combinations. That's also revealing, right? So anything that we could put out there that would help the public get an idea of where the price is going to go, barring us eliminating the teams from the win wager, would really help. So if a smaller track is concerned about what would happen if they cut the teams off, a Mountaineer, for example, then they should use some of these other things on their displays so that the public at least has a sense of where the money's going to go.
Yeah, and I was thinking, that like displaying trifecta prices to people isn't going to help them. That might help people with computer models, but I was thinking you could, if you just aggregated it just to show, here's all the money, but using all that pool information, here's what percentage of all the pools has this horse on top. To me, there's value in that. Now, maybe you could break it out. Here's percentage on top in exacta. Maybe break it out so people could see if there's differences. But just that one aggregate number, then at least they can see across all the pools, as opposed to just one, which is the win pool.
No, and I agree. And I don't there's so much, there's plenty of room on the screen. There's 25 minutes, 30 minutes between races. There's more information, the better. Right. And I have collected. So there was a while where there was trifecta data, like trifecta, will pays, the full trifecta matrix. And we collected a lot of that data and couldn't really find a use for it. And it's, the numbers move all around. A $5 trifecta will change a number, right? It just doesn't take a lot to change a trifecta combination, right? If there's, 336 trifecta combinations in an 8 horse race, if you get caught up in looking at trifecta will pays, with 336 different combinations, it's easy for a little trifecta to end up having a fairly big effect on prices.
Yeah, and that's why I think to help humans, you've got to try to aggregate that data, and that's why I was just thinking there's ways you could aggregate it, into one number even, or just a small number of numbers, as opposed to showing every single combination.
Absolutely. And look, let's go back to the takeout point as well, because I think that's important. I don't understand. We have a lot of these tracks that are heavily subsidized, right? They spend more time lobbying their state governments for monopoly, for monopoly power, right? Casinos and slot machines or whatever they can get to subsidize their purses, to where they really care more about public perception than they do about the horse player. And I just don't understand why these tracks then don't lower takeout. Like, why Kentucky Downs is about to start and their purses are appalling. Right?
Don't get me started.
It's appalling. And is it good for the game to have $200,000 allowance races at Kentucky Downs? Is it good for the game to have their stakes races that are multi-million-dollar stakes races on a surface that's not really, it doesn't even have predictive power, right? I don't know that
No,
those
it's a
courses are.
plowed field. It's not like any other turf
Yeah, it's not
course.
like any other turf course. And we're as an owner, we're running dirt horses on it because it's our only chance to get long distances. And who knows, like they, if they may or may not have any turf ability, but Kentucky Downs doesn't even necessarily reflect that, right? So why can't with their ridiculous $200,000 purses, why can't they lower takeout? Why can't they institute these changes that Naira does with late money movements? Why are they a track that's raised takeout? They could certainly do things to restrict teams. And if we go back to this broader complaint about tote technology, HISA's cost the industry 80 plus $1 million, right? Which is, up to 6% of all purse money. And they can't put any money towards tote modernization. Now, I don't know what tote modernization necessarily means, right? But I know that it's not. I know it. We're not at that, right? And if our totes are where we need it to be, I'd like someone to explain that to me, right? My concerns about the stuff I've done, my data sets of all these late money movements is that they're incorrect and I'm not, getting the correct data, but no one's reached out from the tote company and says this is wrong, this is what we have. Right. So in some ways I would like to see either proof that the tote companies are where we need them to be, or why not spend money there if we're spending 80 plus $1 million on HISA, which has had a negligible effect in some cases on people's perception of how clean the game is, and its safety effect. It's certainly had a safety effect, but it's had a safety effect that has made it worth $80 million a year. Certainly you could chop off some of that money and fix the tote system and fix the integrity of the game. If HISA is about integrity, then the tote system is another place to start.
Absolutely. And, to me, Kentucky Downs is the poster child for, what's wrong with racing. I mean, every aspect of it, everything you described. And then what did they do recently? They raised Takeout.
No, it's
the last track on the planet that should be raising Takeout is Kentucky Downs. That's why I was so, almost enraged at that. And then the hubris they have for talking about it, like, oh, well, they raised our fees on our HISA costs went up. But I mean, the only reason that they are in existence that is they plowed that field so they could get slot money, and they get billions a year from that. Just all enabled because of a few days of racing. Why can't they run at a loss if they have to? Just to enable that billions to keep coming. Just mind-boggling to me. Mind-boggling.
Yeah. Oh, and then the stupid things. It is the sidebar. It's like the freaking Franklin Simpson, a 3-year-old turf sprint, is a great
grade one, right? Yeah.
Talk about invalidating the whole graded stakes committee. I mean that's a reason to basically restart that committee, because that's a total joke. But that's neither here nor there. But Kentucky.
Right.
Kentucky Downs pisses me off to no end, but as an owner, I'm going to be racing horses there because the person.
Right. Well, how can you not? And then, so that means you're not racing them in other places, right? And that's the problem is, it's just sucking horses from other places. But let's don't get me down that rabbit hole.
So, but either way, the point is that
they could reduce Takeout, right? And that would be a great example, right?
These tracks that are subsidized by casino gambling, that have their monopolies, right? They should take some of these chances. Naira and Del Mar are taking these chances, and they're doing it, right, in the face of, Del Mar gets very little outside support. Naira gets much less than a lot of other tracks. So again, I think we really should appreciate the steps that they've taken. I know that, look, there's a lot of reasons that those tracks bear a lot of our criticism, but the fact that they are trying to make steps, at least in the right direction, I think it's important to acknowledge.
So let's talk about the Takeout, because the thing you said about the host fees being the same regardless of the bet type, but the Takeout is different. I absolutely agree. That's always been mind-boggling to me. I'm surprised that the tracks don't charge different host fee for different pools, but they don't. It's So it makes no sense to me why those shouldn't be, the same. It doesn't make sense at all. I totally agree with you that they certainly shouldn't be cutting deals with these teams, especially when they have ownership in Elite and Velocity, giving them a lower prices than everybody else by reducing the host fee. To me, there is a conflict of interest. Maybe it's not illegal, but it's unsavory that they're cutting that kind of deal.
Yeah,
To
now
me,
I don't believe so. I believe that the teams themselves are cutting deals with non-Stronach, and so Naira and Stronach own Elite. All Elite is an ADW, right? So the teams themselves, and from my understanding, the teams paid the Elite pays the standard host fee at
okay, they don't get any reductions that you're aware of in host fee.
Naira and Stronach. Now, not that I'm aware of. Now, again,
Okay.
I don't know that for a fact, and it certainly does it certainly I don't know that for a fact, and it certainly doesn't look it doesn't have the best optics. But I guess I would agree with the point Andy Serling makes that the it's probably better that Naira and that they own the ADW, right? I suppose it doesn't necessarily. Anyway, it's probably better the industry owns the ADW and has some control over these teams.
If they're not cutting a sweetheart deal,
Not cutting
if they charge them no host fee or a reduced host fee, then I don't agree with that. If they do not do anything like that, and again we don't know, then I would agree with you. But the fact we don't know makes you wonder, what's going on. I think there's opportunity for conflicts of interest that are against the other retail players there. Now maybe it's not happening, but to me that makes me uncomfortable.
Well, we don't know. We do know, or we strongly believe that the teams have cut deals with other racetracks. So we hear through the grapevine that it exists. So with some of the smaller tracks, a team will cut deals, and you can see the dramatic difference in late cycle movements. The most recent ones have been at just the most recent. Again, I don't have any evidence of deals that have been cut, but you see sort of dramatic difference in late cycle movements at Fairmont Park / FanDuel. Whereas last year it was about a third of the money that came in the last cycle. This year it's about 2/3 of the money, right? So definitely things are going on there. I don't know of anything. I've never heard anything official. I've heard of whisperings, but you can see evidence of it. And I've heard at least rumors of other tracks that in the past have cut special deals, right? And that to me, everyone should pay the same. Every track should get the same host fee, right? For their product. And that's something that the horsemen can come in and be involved in, right? They should basically say that when we sell our signal, everyone should pay the same host fee. Now,
another reason why that data and transparency around it so a horseman can make informed decisions about that, understand what's happening today and how it impacts them.
Yeah, and they the horsemen understand the long run ramifications. I think that regrettably, everyone's looking for short-term purse enhancements and not thinking of the longer term, right? So everyone's looking, even things like raising host fee, raising takeout are such short-term solutions to what are long-term catastrophes, right, in our game. And so there seems to be very little movement towards dropping host fees and dropping takeout, right? And I feel like about a decade ago, we had a little period of time where host fees either came down or stayed the same, and there was no real change in takeout. And now we just, we've become much more territorial, and host fees have risen. Source market fees are coming up everywhere, right? And so all of these are really damaging to recreational players. I mean, there are many people out there, many of your listeners can't get rebates or get restricted from playing certain tracks because they live in Minnesota and Canterbury's got a big source market fee. And
so explain the source market fee so the listeners that don't understand that.
The source market fee is a fee that the track will extract from the ADW, right, within a certain state to pay them for quote unquote lost handle. So I believe like and I may be wrong about these, and so I'm just going to say I don't want to. I don't know if one exists in certain states. In imaginary. Suppose we had racing in Tennessee.
Well, in Washington they have them. I know that firsthand because I live in Washington. I know other states like New York has a source market, Minnesota. So there definitely exist, right?
Yeah, they definitely exist. I don't know how much they are, but
Okay.
let's say one exists in Virginia, right? And that Virginia has a source market fee of X percent that's added on to that little thing we were talking about where there's host fee, other fees, and rebate. Well, they'll among the other fees will be a source market fee, and those can be substantial, up to 5%. I've heard. And so if we have 10% host fee, 2% other fees, and 5% source market fee, it could be that not only will the player not be eligible to get rebates anywhere, but it doesn't make sense for the track to take the ADW to take certain wagers where they would lose money on low takeout pick fives or on low takeout win pools. And so they have very little incentive to then try to create customers or to incentivize customers. And so those are anti-competitive, and they're, I guess, meant to help the local racetracks, but they often end up screwing the player and doesn't allow the player to have access to rebates and forces them again to pay full freight for what is already an expensive game.
Yeah, that seems like rubbing salt into the wound for retail players that live in those states. And
And
it's an unlevel playing field for those players. They're actually at a huge disadvantage to other players in other states, right?
and I hear it from ADWs. They're like, we just, it doesn't make sense for us to take players in X state because of the source market fee means we can't make any money on them, right?
Yeah,
So,
there are ADWs I cannot sign up for because I live in Washington State for that very reason.
yeah, and so that's the worst of it all. I mean, there is like the whole idea of rebates need to go away. I suppose in a perfect world, right? Everyone would have the same low takeout. But that's, I think that the point of offering suggestions is being, what is realistic, right? And the realistic world is not no one's going to get rebates. The realistic world needs to be, we just need to lower that gap, right? We need to lower the gap between recreational players, weekend warriors, people on track, and the teams and the professional players. I get good rebates, and so I would guess the teams get better rebates than I do, but it's not by all that much because I live in the Tennessee. I have no source market fees, and so that's a big benefit to me, and I wager a decent amount, enough to qualify for decent wagers, and I have good ADWs that I work with.
So what would you think is a realistic approach to the rebate slash takeout, the pricing? What do you think could be done, reasonably in terms of either lowering takeout or increasing rebates for the players that aren't getting them, or some combination of the two? I mean, what do you think is possible, or maybe not possible, could work if there were, tracks were willing to do it?
I'm not I don't quite know how to answer that, right? Because I think that I would like to see a track experiment with lowering takeout. I've made the argument in Tucson in 2020 in 2024 when I was at the symposium that Del Mar and Keeneland are in a unique position because they are independent racetracks with market power. If Louisiana Downs or Hawthorne said, "Hey, we want to lower takeout," the big ADWs, Twin Spires, ExpressBet, TVG, they aren't going to, aren't going to let them. They're going to throttle their signal. They even.
Well, didn't Keeneland even run into that when they tried doing this? I mean,
I don't.
They got blowback. I think just that kind of
sure.
blowback.
I'm sure they get blowback, but no one's going to say we're not going to take Keeneland, right? No one's going to say we're not going to take Del Mar. So what Keeneland can do and what Del Mar can do is they can lower the takeout this is what I think Del Mar should do. They could lower the takeout on all their exotics. They already have the lowest win takeout. I believe that California win takeout is 15.43%, right? So if Del Mar lowered the takeout on all their exotics and didn't change their host fee, and maybe even they could even marginally increase their host fee. I don't want it. I would never suggest that because I don't want to sound, I don't want to be support raising it, but they could certainly keep the host fee the same, right? They would get blowback from the ADWs, but they're a big enough signal, an important enough signal that they'd be able to do it. They'd be able to have their cake and eat it too. They'd be able to advertise, hey, come bet Del Mar. We have the lowest takeout across all wagers. Right? Let's say they did 15.43% for win and they did 18% for all other wagers. Right? They would say we have the lowest takeout on all wagers, and they would only be hurt on track and with California residents. Right? Everyone else, they would get the same host fee from, the same host fee percentage of the dollar. So, and then ultimately they would get,
and they would get more handle probably,
and
right?
they would, yes, because they get
that's our hypothesis that they won't believe, but they probably would get increased handle.
First, they would get increased handle just because of the advertising of it. I think
right.
player would see it, and then people would churn through and bet more. And one argument that is only semi-warranted that I hear is that becomes a game theoretic problem. That when one track lowers the takeout, when people are playing at multiple tracks via the simulcast parlor online, when one track lowers the takeout, then any profits they make from any excess returns that players make from that racetrack, that they get churned into somewhere where the takeout's higher. And so,
partially, right? They may, you're right. Some of that it's because of the tangled web. Some of it's going to get churned.
I would argue that if we had 3 slot machines next to one another and you price them differently, what would happen? Eventually people would realize, oh crap, this slot machine here
is lucky,
and they'll start playing it more.
Right.
And so, I have trust in the fact that people will be able to identify these marginal differences and that they will accordingly react to it. And therefore, to me, it's worth the experiment. And again, Del Mar and Keeneland can do this because they have market power. When Canterbury did it to 15% or when Hawthorne did it to 12%, right, they had to sacrifice in terms of their host fee, right? They had to give up part of their host fee because the Twin Spires and the other ADWs didn't want to give up their margin. And Hawthorne and Canterbury didn't have pricing power. But Del Mar and Keeneland have pricing power. And so certainly it would ruffle some feathers, but it would be worth doing. And to me, it's worth taking the chance.
Yeah, and they don't own the ADWs, right? So they're not taking that loss. Like if it was a Stronic track or a CDI track, they're going to take a hit on the ADW side. But for Keeneland and Del Mar, they're not. They don't have their own. I guess Keeneland has its own Keeneland bets.
Yeah,
but I don't think
it's white labeled. They have a white label. So Keeneland, they probably both do, but they're all white labeled. So they're all ultimately like Keeneland. I think Keeneland's is Twin Spires, right? Keeneland's is Twin Spires. So
I love that idea. And then you're right. Canterbury or Hawthorne taking on the chin, but if say Del Mar and Keeneland did that, or one of them did it, and it was successful like we think it would be, then others would want to do it, and they could get pricing power by doing it together, right? Rather than individually. You could get a block of tracks to say, hey, we want to do this.
Well, a lot of them settle and set their own host fees together anyway, right? So you would think that there's a chance. Now, unfortunately, like the industry doesn't control its own pricing. They have to go through this, it's archaic, go through the state, right? So they have less of an ability to control their own pricing. They have to get approved by the state racing board, which is a little bit of a pain. But I'd like to see more of that. And I've talked about this before. Also, things like Oaklawn offering the show bet bonus, right, which is a 10% takeout on track for show betting, pushing people into pushing casual players into pools where they can win or where they can recycle money, right? If you show up for the track for the first time and you start betting tries and supers or exactas, you're trying to bet a little to win a lot. It's sort of a hopeless outcome, and that's the unfortunate thing is there's too many people out there who are trying to bet a little to make a lot. right? And that's really hard to do. The teams dominate this trifecta superfecta. They dominate the pick five, right? And especially casual players really struggle in those wagers. They struggle beyond. They could get subsidized in those wagers and they would still lose. And I'm not, for myself, if I played I'm pretty sure that if I were an everyday pick five player, that you could probably give me a 0% takeout and I would still struggle, right?
Right.
And so, for
Well, the
people,
more exotic it is, the less the takeout really matters, which is what why I guess is the reason why they price them differently.
yeah.
Um, because that. I mean, people are gonna if they cash for six figures, they're not six figures. Let's just say four-figure cash. They're happy. That they're happy with 1,000 as much as they are, with 1,200 or whatever.
Well, and part of it is field size is a takeout mitigator, right? So,
Right.
an 8-horse field results in, what is it, 56 exact combinations, 336 tries, and 1670 supers, right?
I'm
So
impressed. I'm impressed with that math. Yeah.
well, I know it. I know it only because of the dog tracks have like 8 dogs, and so I just sort of learned that. But that's the net, and that's the net result of that's probably where that tiered takeout rates came from. But it doesn't make sense in a world with fixed host fees.
So two things I want to add, kind of build on what you said. One is even a smaller step Del Mar could take. They've cut the CAWs out supposedly, in terms of batch betting into the win pool. Well, why not just reduce takeout in the win pool too? So now all of a sudden, not as they're only do they have no CAWs, but now it's the lowest, 10%. Make it 10 or 12% takeout. Why not? Again, that would help. They could sell it, and it would funnel players, maybe a little more into that pool where they have a better chance in the pick five or superfectas. Why not take that additional step and cut takeout just for like the reasons you said? I don't know why that would be pretty low risk kind of thing they could do.
Yeah, I get it, and I'd be for that, and there's probably margin to do it given their given the way they do rebate structure. I would, in fairness to them, I would already say that Del Mar has at 15.43% has the lowest takeout rate in the country to win. I may be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. I'm pretty sure that's California win takeout rate. You're the one that records the charts, Chris. I think that's right.
Yeah, I don't think that it's the lowest in the country, but it's of the bigger tracks it is. But still, why not cut it a few more percent? The ones who get hurt the most are the teams, and you've already shut them out of that pool for the most part anyway. So why not do it? And
Yeah,
it's just one pool. Right?
I'm just from their standpoint, they might say, "Hey, we're already giving you a less efficient pool." I don't know. Like I'm obviously I'm never going to stand in the way of reducing takeout, right? I want I want in terms of trying to set things up and trying to talk to racetracks and getting them to do things that they would see as reasonable. I do think there are huge long run benefits from lowering takeout. But as a starting point, just getting to where Del Mar is, I think is huge, right? And so, I love to take baby steps to getting takeout down. And I guess what I would do first is, hey, let's use your market power to try to get all exotics down, and let's advertise that we have the lowest takeout rates in the country. But yeah, it absolutely, look, do I think that tracks takeouts are overall too high in this current marketplace? I would say absolutely, right? Absolutely. Because we're not, it's not that they're competing with other tracks, right? We're competing with the industry overall. We're competing with the gambling dollar that's out there. And racing has some real advantages over other betting products. And one of them is the fact that races are short and quick, right? Minute and 12 seconds, minute 36 seconds, and the race is over and you have an outcome. It's not like betting sports, your effing teeth are getting pulled, right? And first off, and secondly, sorry, you hear the argument that horse racing is too complicated. And that's crazy. Horse racing is the easiest sport out there. Horses are freaking running the circle, right? And whoever puts their nose over the wire first wins. There's nothing less complicated than that, right? It's only complicated because to beat the races successfully, you need to know a lot. But that's the same thing true in any sport, right? So we have the one of the easiest sports to bet, right? And it's easiest sports in terms of what, how we judge outcomes. Whoever's first wins. And they're short races. You can post a race on TikTok or Instagram Reels very easily, right? And we have outcomes and we have hundreds of races a day. So it fits people's current attention span. There's a lot of opportunity with current bettors if we make our product price well, if we're able to fix our problems in the visible pools. In the pari-mutuel system, its one upside is that the tracks don't lose. All we need to do is encourage betting, and anything we can do to incentivize betting helps. And I believe we're just priced wrong. And so, if we can price ourselves better and stabilize the pools, I think we can grow exponentially.
Yeah, here. One other idea that Paul Matisse tweeted out or posted, wherever you call it, on X today, about raising minimums across the board. I thought that was a really good idea for two reasons. One is I think it would help players. They might move away from some of the real exotic wager, or at least when they bet them, they might bet them more efficiently themselves. But also, we talked about how the teams try to extract maximum value, and the lower the minimums are, the deeper they can go into those combinations and bet to extract value. So what do you think about that idea of raising minimums?
Yeah, so I think we should raise minimums. I am less sure that it would shut out the teams. Like I think the teams are able to bet 10-cent, 20-cent, 50-cent increments, right? And they're able to scale, right? And I think it's important to remember that the reason we went to lower increments is to circumvent the W2G and withholding laws. However, I think that even with higher minimums, the teams would still be heavily involved, right? They just wouldn't be able to break up their wagers as much.
Right. They would have less of a edge.
Yeah, I mean, they do have an edge in terms of size, right? I mean, they can bet a lot more and effectively in some of these pools push people around. But
they're not going to play some of the less likely outcomes that they would. If they can go all the way down to 10 cents, they might be playing every possible combination. Yeah. If they have to play it at $1, they're gonna be pruning that tree, right?
I often think about like the pick five, right? Especially on these carryover days in terms of how to attack the pick five, is that the general public is going to be all over the 0 to 30% range, right? And so the key is getting into that outlying area, right, where the public isn't, right, to where you're going to get magnified payouts, right? The pick five should, based on relative takeouts, pay about twice what the parlay does. And if too many favorites run in, or if it's too high probability of an outcome, it doesn't pay well. And so it's when you get into that outer range, and in that outer range, you either can get carryovers, or you can get payouts of 4 or 5 or 3 of 5, and it's in that outer range that the teams can reach, especially with the lower denominations. And so if you make it a higher denomination, teams can't reach there. I've often thought that one way to attack the pick 5 is just to throw out the bottom 40% and start digging into the 40 to 60% range in attacking it.
So when you say the 40% range, throw out the lowest likelihood 40%.
Yeah, so throw out the combinations to where, and maybe be the lowest 30%. The combinations, the first $300 or $400, $500, $1,000, where all the public's going to be, where you aren't going to get outsized payouts, and then start digging into harder outcomes to get to. And that's in essence what a lot of your listeners have already talked about, right? The idea of tossing favorites, or making sure that you don't have a ticket with five short price horses in a pick five, right? You got to have somewhere where you separate out from the field. I've tried to think about ways to be a little more systematic about that. It'd be interesting to look at. But with the higher denominations, that not only it not only it affects teams, it affects a lot of players in terms of their ability to reach out further and should probably help, right? That should probably help. So I guess in that way, I agree with it. I think there's easy ways to experiment here. You could have you can maybe not change the pick five, but make the pick four a $3 minimum, right? Or maybe not change the superfecta, but make the trifecta a $5 minimum, right? So I think there are ways to keep one pool one way and to change another pool, right? So I certainly to start off, I would get rid of the 10-cent super. I would have supers be either 50 cents or $1, right? And so, but I think one way to do it to balance it is to maybe keep your um, your pick 50-cent pick five, but go to $5 pick fours, right? Do something to where one of the pools is one of the pools that are very similar, almost substitutes for one another. One is low denomination, one is high denomination. There's no reason for them all to be low denomination.
Yeah, and I like the idea of, you don't have to like figure out, oh, we're going to make changes to everything all at once. You can experiment, like you said, try this and compare it to how it was before and after and how it is to similar pools. Think like you do as an economist, research economist. That makes perfect sense. And then learn from that and then make adjustments. And then if it's successful, then you can spread it further. But yeah, why not make a small change and see what the impact. I mean, that's the frustrating part about this industry. Most other industries, that's just a natural way they operate. They're always looking for new ways to improve. They're trying things out, piloting things out, learning from it, moving to, scaling it up if it works and throwing it out if it doesn't. But you just don't have that mentality in this industry. It's really frustrating.
Well, I wrote a paper, Nick McKinney and I wrote a paper, this is 15 years ago, on the trifecta. Did the superfecta shark the trifecta pool when they dropped from a dollar to a dime? Just we wanted to see the effects across pools, because the dropping the superfecta to a dime, right? It should affect complementary. It should affect pools that it's a substitute for, and the tri is a very similar pool, right? I so long ago I forget the result, and I'm not even sure if we ever really published it. We moved on to different things, so it's just interesting to look at. And so there are no reasons you can't go the other direction in certain pools, and there's so many different betting pools that we have. Why not experiment? Doesn't have to be the same. Doesn't have to be the same minimums across all these pools, especially pick four, pick five, pick six. No reason not to mess around with those a little. And
Yeah.
look, doing that, we see $3 pick threes. We see $3 all turf pick threes. I don't know, however, that in those wagers that we're seeing, what we're seeing is, it may be hard to separate out what we're seeing from there are no teams involved versus versus it's giving us the right outcome in terms of greater variation in parlay in win parlay value, right? So that's what we don't see. That's what I don't know the answer to.
Yeah. And the other part, and this may be more controversial, but the natural inclination for anything is to become more and more bigger and more complex. And the wagering menu in racing reflects that. I mean, there's just all these new wagers keep being added on and on and on. Maybe that's not a good thing. Maybe at some point you need to pare it back and simplify the menu, and that might benefit everybody. That's just something I'll throw out there. Maybe disagreement. Certainly would be disagreement on the particulars about, what types of wagers could we toss out. But I mean, a great example to me is, do you really need tries and supers and pick fives, super high fives? You need all three of them.
Well, it certainly doesn't make any sense. Like looking at what Texas is doing, the fact that they've cut themselves off the rest of the world, it's like stepping back in time. It really is. Now, I would say it's like stepping back in time, but they did let the teams in this year, so I would be careful there.
Well, stepping back in time, but a little bit nearer when we first let the
Yes,
teams
it's
in,
better
right?
in 2024 than 2025, at least
Yeah.
what I believe. I may be wrong about that, but um, in Texas, they still have all of the like pick three, pick four, pick five, and at that point, when your handle's smaller, you should just chop off some of those pools.
Right. Because you
But
want liquidity, right? There's a
yeah,
liquidity issue there for them.
but in a lot of the big tracks, there's plenty of liquidity.
Yeah.
I mean, you can see the difference though. I mean, the reality is a lot of players, especially recreational players, should stick to the win pool and should use other wagers to basically expand opinions they already have about a certain horse to win.
That's a perfect segue. Let's go right to that. All right, given everything we've talked about, let's get away from what could the industry do. Now you're out, the listeners out there, most are going to be horse players. What can they do to increase their, improve their results given the landscape we just described? So starting with simplifying what they bet. So go keep
Yeah.
riffing
Well,
on that.
look, the key is teams or no teams. The win pool the win pool is certainly at Naira and Del Mar is much more playable now, right? You're only picking one. You're not trying to pick five. A pick five is very challenging. A superfect is very challenging, and it behooves most recreational players to play the win pool. And a win pool is also, from the racetrack's perspective, a churn-inducing wager, right? And I'll give you some statistics, and these are incredible stats. In 1968, right, racing was dominant, right? Probably the peak, probably racing was at its peak. In pretty much every major metropolitan area, the racetracks were on par with Major League Baseball in terms of attendance, and they were well ahead of the NBA. Now, part of it is the NBA wasn't the same, right? The Chicago Bulls, for example, drew 3,000 fans a game. In New York, Aqueduct had 135 race days, and they averaged 30,000 people at the races. That was more than the New York Mets, who had 21,000 people average attendance that year, and the New York Yankees 14,000. The Knicks were 13,000, more than the Rangers. It was everything except for the football teams. Aqueduct dominated. They also that year had $2.9 million bet per card. And in today's dollars, that's over $30 million per card. That's incredible to think about the volume people churn. Now, part of it was there were only whips. And in only betting whips, those were churn-inducing wagers.
And whips
now,
win, place, show.
Yep. And so
okay.
now the pick three, pick four, pick five, these are much more favorable to players, right? Because you're only hit with takeout once. So you can really leverage your wager with multis. Right? If you bet the double, you're going to get typically 1.25 times parlay, right? And as you get more and more out into combinations, or the pick five, you get to almost twice parlay. And so you're only hit with in the pick five, you're hit with the takeout once. And often it's a low takeout, 15%. Pick five, you're only hit with it once. You bet five win bets, right? You're hit each time with a 16 to 18% takeout. And so that gives us the larger payout in the pick five versus a win parlay, or the larger payout in the double versus a win parlay. Right? So it sounds great, and the tracks promote these wagers, but most players can't pick five races in a row, right? And construct a ticket to do that efficiently. And so certainly in the good old days, people were forced to only bet to win. We don't want to restrict them to just doing that. But the reality is most players should focus on betting to win, and then only play these picks, or only play verticals and horizontals when they can have a certain number of races they can put together, or when they have a certain philosophy about how a race is going to play, really beating favorites, right? So the only reasons I now play a pick five are if I have a couple of races I really like, where I really think I can beat a favorite, and I hope to just expand my payout, right? So where I love a horse at a certain price, and I love a couple other races and expand my payout. So I think that simplicity is a place to start, right? And the win wager is the most simple wager. So almost nothing's involved in terms of its construction, right? You're just picking a horse to win, right? So there's no bet construction. The only thing that's really involved in is bet sizing, right? How big should I bet to win? Every other wager involves some sort of construction. So in terms of any novice player out there, start off by betting to win. Now, my guess is you're not, if you're listening to this podcast almost 2 hours into a two-part podcast, you're more than a novice player. At that point, you should listen to a lot of Chris's other podcasts. And when you think about the pick five or superfectas, you should really think about ticket construction and know that you're facing right higher takeout and large involvement of teams.
Yeah, I would say absolutely agree with everything you said. Even if there weren't teams, I think that's good advice. But I'll say a couple of things. One is the more complex the pool, the more important your ticket construction is, and the less important your handicapping is. So you kind of said this, at the win pool, there's not a whole lot of ticket construction. So, but a pick five, it's a big deal. And so, if you want to become and you want to make money long term on these more complex pools, you have to get better at the betting side of it more so than the handicapping. Now, for the win betting, you don't really have to spend a lot of time thinking about betting. We could talk about bet sizing, and you talked about Kelly. That's probably the best way to do that. But even flat bets, to win, that's a simple way to play it. And if your handicapping's any good, you could maybe beat the takeout or even make a profit. So that's a great place to start. The other thing I'll say is the teams where they excel is in bet execution and ticket construction. So the more complex the wager, the more powerful and the bigger the enemy is. So you're really going against somebody with huge advantages in a pick five or a superfecta from a betting standpoint. Those teams, that's where they excel. Whereas in the win betting, they don't really have any advantage on ticket construction. And even from a handicapping standpoint, if you're selective about what races you bet, you can probably find a subset of the races where if you put the work in, your handicapping is better than the computers. Now, some people may disagree with me, but I say that because I think I'm better than the computers in some of these races. So being able to figure out what your strengths are and where you maybe have an edge on them, and if you're selective, that's the other way I think you can beat the teams. You can out handicap them on occasion if you're selective, and but you probably can't out bet them in those complex bets, even regardless of how good your handicapping is. So I don't know if you agree with that or want to have anything to add, but that's kind of how I'd look
I
at
think
that.
you can out handicap them. You just can't out handicap them in every race, in every card across the country and across the world, right?
Absolutely. Yeah,
But
they would kill you in a handicapping
yeah,
contest if you had to play every race, right?
yes, but you only, you don't have to bet every race. You don't have to bet any races. You can sit on your hands and wait for the right spot. And when you find the right spot, you can beat them, right? And so that's the key. The other part of it is waiting for the right spot. There are situations where, look, I'm not saying don't bet the super or don't bet the pick five. I think there's situations where you should absolutely lean into those bets, but you should have certain opinions. And I'll give you one where if you are narrowing your ticket construction, right? Sometimes you can really slam a try or super. The superfecta in the Jim Dandy. The Jim Dandy finished Sovereignty, Baeza, Hill Road, and Moplex, right? Sandman finished fifth. The exacta on that day paid 2-1, but the superfecta paid 18-1. Right? 18-1. And if you had Sovereignty, Baeza, even Hill Road, Moplex, Sandman, right? If you got let's say you just had Hill Road finishing third or fourth, right? You could get that down to where it's 6-1, right? So a straight superfecta was 18-1. You could probably do a 1-by-1 by 2-by-1 combination and get there, or two of those. So a $4 bet to where you're getting $18 back or $19 back gets you 4-1. It's not bad, right? And so there are ways that if you're very narrow in your ticket construction, that you can make those wagers pay out. And
Right, but that was where you're making your money. It's not your handicapping opinion, because what you're saying is everybody knew that Sovereignty was the most likely winner and Baeza was second most likely by a lot. So it didn't take a lot to handicap that, but the way you made money on that was thinking through how will this get bet, and is there a way I can construct a ticket and be tight about it and still have a good chance to be right, and that's all about ticket construction, right?
Well, and the other thing is like, it's easy to get caught up, like the Derby, it's easy to get caught up with the fact that the pools are just out of whack because it's not only that the teams, it's too risky for the teams to bet as much as they'd like to on the Derby because they could lose their whole year, right? Because the teams are almost irrelevant in the Derby. Because if they bet enough to arbitrage the pools and they're wrong and Rich Strike wins, they could lose millions of dollars, right? So that's where we get the situation like we had this year with sovereignty being 8-1, 10-1, most of the betting, and journalism being 5-1. I think it's easy to overlook the fact that I got so caught up in the fact that, these are incredible win wagers that you lose the fact that a narrow try of sovereignty journalism Baeza, right, ended up paying $115 for 50 cents. So there's still, if you're narrowing your approach, they're great payoffs at exotics. And they exist even when the win pool is very limited in terms of team action.
But
So
you have to be thinking about it from a betting perspective
yes,
when you get into those more complex wagers, is the point I was trying to make. It's not so much the handicapping. It's really understanding how to bet it is the only way you can be successful if you want to play in those pools. I'm not saying don't play in them, but realize your betting skills have to be on par or better than your handicapping skills if you want to move into those pools.
yeah, no, and look, that's the point of probably most of the podcasts that you've done here is that you have to do the work. And in these more complicated wagers, it's a lot, it's really bet construction is paramount, right? So that's the key. Now, as far as recreational players go, I would like to see better tools for recreational players. I think more and more tools are being worked on. I've seen some stuff that like Joe Applebaum is working on that involves AI in ticket construction. There are other tools available. I know Amwager has done a bunch of stuff to help with ticket construction as well, just so that people can build more efficient tickets and help them compete with what the teams are doing.
Yeah, definitely. The other thing is, I think trying to understand, maybe this podcast might help, kind of how the teams operate and understand. And like I think one of the key things is that the teams are really trying to reduce variance. So especially in their betting, they're trying to bet as many combinations as they can in a weighted fashion, where they reduce the risk. Their chances of losing a lot goes way down, and their likelihood of their strike rate goes way out. They don't kill it when they hit it, but they grind that profit out, and that's what they're really trying to do. They're trying to reduce risk and maximize churn, and with a positive EV, so that they're not trying to take big swings. And like you said, they're risk averse to that. And even in the handicapping perspective, they prefer those 5-horse fields at parks where it's really easy to price everything, and they can bet all those exotics and you hit every combination, the weighted right, and that's where they're going to excel. So if you're playing like the superfecta, in a 6-horse field, or the early pick 5 at these tracks where the bunch of small fields, you're going to get killed going up against the teams. But where they're less adept and you have a better chances, that big race of 14 horses that are 2-year-olds that are lightly raced, or a state-bred turf sprint at NYRA with 12 horses, with all kinds of potential bad trips and stuff. Those chaotic races, they don't like them as much. They're not as certain about things, and their pricing is going to be less precise, and they're going to bet accordingly. So, to me, you're best off if you're trying to compete with the teams. This has been my recipe anyway, is look for the most chaotic races and play the simple bets in those races, because that's where you might be able to find value in the win pool in those chaotic races. And like you said, if you have some additional opinions, maybe you can build out into the exacta or the adjacent race if you like that. But to me, that's where they hate. They're risk averse. They hate uncertainty. They really want to reduce variance. So if you can find the places where if the variance is high and the betting is simple, because the more complex the bet, the bigger the edge they have. To me, that's the sweet spot against the teams. That's kind of where I would recommend. I'm not sure if we're on the same page there, but I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah,
So
no,
that's
I agree with that. I think the other thing is really cutting against the grain. The teams tend to push down the prices of favorites. They tend to prefer early speed, right? And they tend to, there's certain other scenarios where they find, they're basically looking for horses that are quote unquote under bet. And so you need to look at for horses that are at least historically may even have been over bet, but find out scenarios where they're likely to overperform. So overperform even though they're getting pushed, even though the market's pushing the other way, right? And so one area that teams really like horses that have run before, right? They are really against firsters, and so I'd be careful about firster steam. The public tends to overbet firster steam, which is why the teams go in the other direction. But if you do have insights, pedigree insights, or some other insight on why a horse might run good, that's also semi against public steam, I would take it. I would say that now is probably a time where it really helps to be a long shot player, because in the past, long shots that maybe were 20-1 might be 40-1 today, right? Because as they make the market more efficient and as they push down win prices to 2-5, that when you can beat an overrated, overhyped favorite, is when you can get great payouts. Now, the reality is they tend to bet against hype. So horses that tend to be 2-5 because they're overly hyped up, the teams will have less of a value. But if you find the 2-5 shot that looks good on paper and checks a lot of boxes, and if you can find out a way to beat those horses, especially throw it out of the number, you can get much bigger payouts. So, beating favorites, knocking them out of the try and super, especially when they fit a lot of the team's criteria in terms of look good on paper, early speed. That's when you can get better payouts. So again, it's maybe the time to where being a long shot player who sits on their hands, this may be a good era for that player.
Yeah, and you have to be able to deal with the mental challenge of that approach.
Yes.
But I do think, it's always helped to be contrarian in this game. But I think now you've got to try to understand being contrarian with the general public isn't as valuable as being contrarian with the teams. I think it's kind of what you're saying. If you understand sort of where they tend to maybe focus their attention, and you can get outside that, that sphere of where they're focused, the rewards can really be oversized. But yeah, it's trying to think of your competition, think about those teams. I talk to players and say they don't worry about them, but I think if you really want to be successful, you got to sort of understand, where you're more likely to find value, or you're going to be fishing in ponds that don't have any fish, right?
No, I think it's worth learning from them. I've definitely from them have learned that to really fade steam and really be cautious about firsters, and especially like handicapping Saratoga. There's so much steam and so many workout reports there that get overbet. And I basically have stopped subscribing to workout reports. I'll ask people about how horses working, but I tend to want to bet against those horses, especially if there are other firsters in a race, because those steam horses get overbet. And then the public tends to overemphasize really recent form, especially as it relates to high profile horses, right? And with these high profile horses, one day they're useless and should retire. The next day they can't be beat, right? Sierra Leone's a perfect example, right? Before his effort in the Whitney, he needs a perfect setup. right? Everything has to go his way. After the Whitney, he's like, it's, this is the dominant horse. This is the horse that should be favorite for the Classic.
Even though he had a pretty good
Yeah,
setup.
I got a pretty good setup. So it's like these things that go in cycles. And so
Yeah.
I cannot wait to bet against him next time, right? Because he's going to be overbet because it's like he becomes a now horse. And it's certainly on the 3-year-old trail. You
Well,
can,
Sovereignty, I love it. The greatest example with me is Sovereignty. People were saying Journalism was the greatest horse of all time after the Preakness. They made him the favorite over Sovereignty in the Belmont. They were rating him as number one 3-year-old in the, I don't know, the NTRA polls. Made no sense at all, right? And after after that race, the Belmont, all of a sudden, and in Sovereignty's latest race, he's like one of the greatest horses of all time, the best horse since Spectacular Bid, and it's just one race where he beat Baeza by half a length.
yeah.
It
happens.
is amazing.
It
It's
happens
amazing.
every year. Like,
Yeah.
I did remember, many of these Derby horses win the Derby and it stands out, right? Like I remember Orb was like going to win the Triple Crown, right? And then, it was like one race with a perfect trip. And so,
An incredibly perfect setup. That
yeah,
was one of the setups of all setups he got in that Derby.
exactly. And so, so especially in those real public races, the teams tend to fade steam. And
They
I think
fade the
that's
narrative a lot of times. Yeah.
fade,
And
fade speed, fade steam, fade the narratives. And I think that's an important lesson to learn. So I also think there are lessons to learn from, they just get back to, what we think are the basics of handicapping.
yeah, and that recency bias is what you're talking about. Has always been strong. It's always been one of the things I'm always looking to try to knock a horse that's coming off, an impressive win. Was it really as impressive as it looked? Is there, you're trying to poke holes in that. And I think that kind of mindset is, really important. You have to be able to zig when others are zagging. Now you can't just zig because everyone's zagging. You got to have a reason, right? You don't want to always be against every favorite, and but the idea is your mindset is to try to poke holes, try to find a way to get off the beaten path, and that's where you want to be. You don't force your way through when there's nothing there, but you're looking all the time for those opportunities. That's the way you have to approach it.
Well, the other thing that they do is they're very cognizant of the odds, right? And the odds reflecting probabilities. And they're betting when they have edges. And so I think horse players, it's very easy to lose sight of picking winners versus looking at their probabilities relative to the odds. There should always be an odds level where you're bet against a horse and bet on a horse, right? So I think it's important to think about, hey, I would bet Sierra Leone at this number, right? But I would bet against him at this number. And that should exist for every horse. I think it's easy to get locked in on one horse winning a race and then not veer based upon what you see going on in the prices. And now, especially that the win pool, I still think the win pool does incorporate some negative steam. So I still do, even in Naira, I still do. If the horse is dead on the board, I'll still be dubious of that horse and still probably not bet it if it's too high of a price. But it's important to think about everything in terms of probabilities and to be light on your feet, right? You may love a horse, and if it's the wrong price, sit on your hands or go elsewhere.
Yeah, for me, that is what distinguishes being a handicapper versus a horse player. If all you're doing is handicapping a race and picking the winner, great, that might be fun. But if you're really going to become a horse player and when you want to bet on your opinions and try to make money, then you have to incorporate that price and look for value. I mean, that's just a major step. And there's a lot of players out there that never make that step, and that's fine. They may be perfectly happy being in that handicapping only world. But if you consider yourself a horse player, and you want to get better at it and better at it by, improving your betting results, you have to take that next step and start factoring in price and value.
Well, this is where you could say that Delmar almost got a little unlucky, right? Is if we assume that those final odds are fairly a fair reflection of a horse's chances of winning. The fact that you had an 18-1 drop to 6-1 and then win, right? there were actually 29 major odds droppers over the course of the first 2 weeks at Del Mar. So 29 horses, I would call them major odds droppers, were horses that had a 50% increase in the amount bet on it to win after the last cycle. So horse that went from having 10% to win on it went if it went to 15% to win on it, I would call that a major odds mover. Right. So it's a little tricky to measure odds movements, right?
Because a long shot doesn't take as much as a favorite.
Going from 30 to 1 to 21 is not as big a move as you think, right?
Right. Not anything like going from 8 to 5 to even money, right?
Yeah, or like 8 to 1 to 7 to 2, like one of the big odds droppers. So it's hard to break up. So there were 29 big odds droppers, and 7 of them won, right? But the fact is that all of them, the fact that 29 existed is the problem, not that we just happen to have 7 winners and 7 light up the tote board, right? It's thankfully we did, because as a result of it happening, as a result of those horses winning, right, it precipitated the change that we got.
Yeah, it was made lemonade out of the lemons.
Yes, exactly.
But one thing I have to throw out, because I am sort of a takeout hawk, in that I just want players to be aware of the takeout, because I do think they're not in a lot of cases. So I always try to raise player awareness of takeout and how they'll discover, if they look into like some of the stuff I put out on social media, how it varies drastically and dramatically from track to track, but not just from track to track, but from pool to pool within the track. I mean, there's some tracks where the early pick 5 is 14%, not exactly, but thereabouts, and the late pick 5 is 24%. And I'll just say those tracks might be out in California. I won't name them. If you want to find out, look at the stuff I do on social media. I mean, the same bet early in the card and late in the card is dramatically different from a takeout perspective. And that takeout, if you're not getting rebates, is a killer. So the other thing I'd recommend is be aware of takeouts and, avoid those higher takeout pools unless you really have a strong opinion and enough to overcome that takeout. But I would recommend you spend more time in the lower takeout pools. In certain tracks, they have, unfortunately, they typically are like a pick 5. But there are in the California tracks, they have a lower takeout, late double, and they've got a special pick 3, I think, and a pick 4. I can't remember, but I don't have all my charts memorized, but I try to summarize all that out there. But be aware of that, and target your wagering where it's more favorable, where there's no CAW play, where the takeout's reasonable, and Del Mar, like you said, relative to most tracks, their takeout in the win pool is good. Now the changes they've made with CAWs makes that a much more playable pool. And if you're going to bet on Del Mar, that I would start with the win pool, for all the other reasons we talked about as well. But learn about the takeouts and understand how difficult that is. Not only is that superfecta, and plus the higher the takeout, the more likely the pools are, the teams are playing in those, because they're getting the bigger rebates, like you said. They're just getting, the bigger the takeout, the more rebate they're getting. So if you're playing the superfecta with a 26% takeout, which is not unusual for tracks to have, not only are you competing against those teams that are doing all those wagers at the last second with these sophisticated models, but you're paying 26% on the dollar. You get 26% less than you would have if there was no takeout, or at least 10 or 15% less than you would get, at smaller takeout pools. So, that long term is going to eat at your profitability, or at least increase your losses if you're not profitable. So keep in mind, be aware of that takeout, I think can help as well.
Yeah, if you're playing a high takeout pool, you have to have an opinion, and you have to be very narrow in executing your opinion. Otherwise, if you're just trying to churn money through a high takeout pool, it's doom.
Yeah, amen. That absolutely right. There, and takeout does matter whether you think it does or not. Now, there's some people who will say, I'm so good and I'm playing into these high variance pools, takeout doesn't matter. And for some of those players, and one who says that a lot, and I won't necessarily disagree with him, is Tommy Massis, but we're not all Tommy Massis. Most of us aren't. And we probably could benefit from, playing in a track where you're, in a pool where you're going to get more money back if you do win, right?
Yeah, if you're winning without takeout, you're in the you're one in 50,000, one in 10,000 in this game. One in it just I would seek out takeout. I would seek out rebates if you're winning without takeout, and it's worth finding a residency in another state where you can get rebates if you can beat this game, because then if you can beat it without takeout, then your handle should be able to explode, and you should be able to do this professionally. So if that's really true, find a little plot of land in Tennessee and seek out rebates.
Yeah. Now, so anything else on the pricing? Because I was going to talk about a couple other areas where players might get better. But anything else on the pricing side or on the race and pool selection?
No.
So we talked some about price discovery, and this is somewhere where I think players need to start investing more time. Like I said, back in the day, you just could use the tote board and that's all you needed. But that day is over. And I think people really do need to get better price discovery. This is where I think the industry can really help. We talked about that, in terms of trying to understand what the price is going to be on a horse. And there was a time where the first piece of price discovery is really the morning line, and some morning lines are better than others. But there can be big mistakes on those morning lines. To be able to spot those is really important. That you don't, because then, especially if you're someone who likes to zero in on the horse, you might get fixated on a horse because it's 10-1 on the morning line. When in reality, if you really thought about it, this horse isn't going to be higher than 3 or 4-1. But if you go into that mindset, you're going to bet it anyway, and they bets it down to 3 or 4-1, and it's really not a bet. So I think you've got to start thinking about and using some of those tools, looking at will pays and stuff, but also just your own knowledge about, what do you think this horse is going to be off at? What has it been? Do they normally bet on this horse? Is he dropping in class or going up in class? You usually can get a line. Who are the connections? The trainer? Is this the leading rider jumping on? All those things are going to impact the morning line. Now, the morning line maker is supposed to take that into account, but some are better than others. And if you can get good at that, I think it's a skill that's worth having. One thing I'd love to see the tracks do is we've talked about how these computer teams are good at estimating the off odds. Well, there's no reason why the tracks can't develop tools, to do a morning line that's better than humans. I'm not saying they necessarily are there yet today, but someday the morning line could be automated, would be a pretty good guesstimate of what the off odds are going to be. And then the tracks could show an update to that, just like these teams models are, where they start incorporating tote information from all the pools to update their original model. I mean, to me, that's an area where players could get better now if they just spend more time thinking about what's the price of this horse going to be. If there's a horse you're thinking about playing, stop and try to estimate what you think realistically this horse is going to be at. That's part of, I think, your analysis you ought to start doing as a player that most players don't do. But I think longer term, and from a track perspective, they could come out with, better tools to develop morning line and maybe have like this real-time morning line that's getting adjusted as more information comes in on the tote. So by the time it's a couple minutes from post time, they've got a good estimate of what the off odds are going to be that they can show to players. Any
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I guess the only thing I don't love about like some of the bottles of off odds is I guess I'm not a huge black box fan, right? And I'd love to know where some of these are coming from. I know DRF has like an imputed odds or an off odds estimator that I don't think is great, and I'm not sure it's any better than using some of the will pays. And so I suppose I like the fact that they exist, but I would like more information on where they come from. And yeah, look,
or some evaluation of how well they perform, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I'm assuming they could get. I'm not assuming they have the tools now that are good, but certainly they could develop them if they'd invest a little bit in doing so, I think. And then
Well, look,
they could measure the performance, right? There's ways you could objectively measure how well your morning line projects that's something you can measure.
yeah. Now, I mean, look, the price discovery is the key, right? And it's the key part of the edge the teams have, right? Is the fact that they are good at price discovery and of course they can use all that information and make their bets. And if we had a better sense of where prices are going, I think players would bet more. And then this is why what Del Mar and Naira are doing are working. I sort of also think it's important to understand what your horse that you're going to bet's price is going to be. What's a good price and what's not a good price, and where do you start to fall in the range where your horse isn't taking the money it should, right? And I don't think that necessarily matters for a horse that is in good form and has been raced frequently. But if there are other factors involved, I think it's important to be keenly aware when your horse isn't taking money and it should be, right? So, there's probably a range where you're thinking, I think this horse is going to be 3 or 4 to 1 and it's worth a bet. If it's 2 to 1, I probably won't bet it. But it's certainly taking a lot of active money. And if it's 6 to 1, either I'm missing something or they're really cold on this horse, right? So there's probably a band where you think of that, and you may get stung. Sometimes you may get stung that the horse at 6 to 1 might win, but I think often, at least for me, when the horses I like aren't bet, someone knows something I don't know.
I like the way you talk about putting the band on it. So, everybody always that's a value player always does the left side you talked about where, okay, I want to get at least 4 to 1 on this. If I get 4 to 1 or better, I'll play it. It's 2 to 1. I'm going to pass, right? That's kind of the standard value play in the win pool. What you talk about, that other side of the band, is kind of interesting. That okay, yeah, it's not just it's not just better than 4 to 1. I'm getting 20 to 1 on this horse. I don't understand that. That surprises me. Then you probably ought to think twice about whether or not you want to make that bet. If nothing, scale back your bet as opposed to scaling it up like you might do otherwise, unless, and this is where I put the caveat in, unless you expected that horse to be 20 to 1 because you know exactly why everyone else is making it 20 to 1 and why you think it should be 4 to 1. If in that case, I would say you make the bet if it's 20 to 1. Who cares? That's what you expect it to be. But if you thought, I expect this horse to be 6 or 8 to 1, I think it should be 4 to 1, and say it's coming off a layoff, or I think this is where you're getting at. It's coming off a layoff, or it's coming off a claim, or some change. Where there could be something new being introduced that you're not aware of, and all of a sudden it's 20 to 1. Then you might think, oh, wait a minute, maybe it's not ready off the layoff. Maybe they're not trying here, or maybe something's off with the horse or something. Is that kind of what you're thinking?
Yeah, no, that's right. That's right. Look, I'd say the 3 or 4 to 1 I bet, 2 to 1 I don't bet, 6 to 1 I don't bet. If it's suddenly 20 to 1, I'm like, I have to bet for insanity insurance, right?
But you might not bet. You might make
No, yeah,
scale back your bet, right?
but that would be right. I mean, the point is that you should have a good sense of what the odds should be,
Right.
right? And if your horse isn't getting bet, especially if there's new information, if there's layoffs or there's something that's equipment change or something that's going on that lends itself to some uncertainty that you're viewing positively and the market's viewing negatively, then you should just be keenly aware of it, right? Whether you end up betting the horse or not. It is about finding value, but the board itself gives you a lot of information. And
Right.
even with the changes at Naira, I still think there's situations where I look at the board and it's clear that the horse isn't taking the money that I thought it would, and most of those turn out to be bad bets.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Another reason why spending more time on what you think the odds will be and understanding what would be the range of, I like that, the range of odds, where this horse is going to be. And if it goes off substantially lower than that, then I expect that something's going on that I don't know about. And if it's substantially higher than I expect, there's probably something going on that I don't know about. And kind of factor that into your betting decision. How you factor that in kind of depends on a lot. But I mean, for instance, if it's much higher than you expected, so again, there's probably some information you're missing if you've really thought about it and given it, some thought. Then you might either pass your bet, like you said, or maybe bet a little bit just in case it wins anyway. But you definitely probably want to lower your estimate of its chances of winning some with that new information. And on the other end, again, if it's bet much lower, then you may want to raise your estimate of its winning than you expected. Again, it's if then you expected. If you knew they were going to bet this horse down, like let's give the example of Sierra Leone. If you know they're going to overbet him next time, and in this race, based on that, you think he's going to be 4-5, and he goes off at 4-5, that shouldn't change anything. But if he's if he's 2-1 or something, you might be missing something. And if he's 1-5, you might be missing something. That's kind of what you're getting at. And I think you need to adjust your probabilities that way. And where I think it's important is, let's use the example where you think the horse is going to go off at 2 or 3-1, and it's going off at even money, and you don't understand why, right? That would tell me there's some information I don't have that's built into the odds. So I probably need to raise, my expectations for that horse winning. I might not raise it as high as, the even money. And this is what kind of Bill Bittner does. He kind of splits the difference or makes some adjustments. But I might not necessarily then want to jump on my second choice that I thought was going to be, 2-1, and now it's 5-1, right? That I may not necessarily go to that bet, because I probably need to adjust down the chances that horse is winning if I'm adjusting up the other horse. So I think you need to be factoring all this in, that information. And in order to do that, you have to have formed some opinion about what you expect the odds to be. It's that part of price discovery. It's not just predicting what the off odds are going to be so you know what you're going to get. It's making sure you can understand what these tote signals tell you. If you get a tote one, you can detect some of these tote signals. But if you don't have some idea of that, then you really can't ever identify when there's maybe information you're missing that you need to incorporate into your thinking.
Yeah, no, I agree with all that.
And Dean Towers goes one farther. He's begun to start to follow the steam in some of these cases where he expects it to be in a certain range and it's much lower than expected. He's followed that money and seen they're right a lot more often than you'd expect them to be. And I think a lot of this he's found more on the harness side, but he's starting to apply that to the thoroughbreds because we're starting to move in that direction. So that, I could never do that. That would be too much against the way I always played. But, there are players like Dean who are trying to really listen closely to that signal, and they might even follow along in certain cases, if that makes any sense.
No, that's tough to do, and it can be really frustrating, right? In that if you handicap a race and then you jump off your opinion to follow at least what you perceive the teams are doing, right? And then you're wrong, right?
Yeah.
And you're right in your handicapping. So it's, look, there's just this game is tougher, and it's tougher than ever. And I think that's that's in part not only what the teams have done, but the fact that there's not a lot of dead money, right? And that's why the Triple Crown's wonderful to follow. And even these 3-year-old races are wonderful to follow because these horses, they can be bet really erratically. And that doesn't exist anymore in our pools in general. I hear stories from from bettors that again 40 years ago, every day would be, you just never knew what the odds would be, right? There's some degree of randomness. It just doesn't exist today anymore.
Yeah, and for sure. And I would never advocate people getting off their opinions based on the odds board. I just think you need to, it's like Bentner did, you need to factor that. There's information there, and you need to factor that in. But in order to really use it, you have to be thinking ahead to what you'd expect to see on the board, and then adjust if it's not what you saw. And I would never like bet a horse I didn't like because it's getting bet. Like I could never do that. But it might get me to back off and bet less, or maybe not bet at all on a horse I planned on betting. Um, but in order to do that, you have to have some idea of what that range of odds should be. And when it's much lower or much higher than you expected, recognize that means that there's a signal and there's some information that you haven't factored into your prices, that you need to, think a little bit differently about how you're going to attack that race, if at all.
Yep.
That's something I don't think people need to do nearly, certainly in the win pool, back when the Tote board pretty much told you what you were going to get. There are still cases where, that there might be late changes and for other reasons, but that was, the exception rather than the rule.
No, I agree.
All right. So we talked about, being more selective, simplifying your betting, trying to get rebates where you can, pay attention to takeout, and the lower takeout pools are probably better. Kind of focusing on specializing and finding your strengths and playing there. And again, that's probably a good reason to avoid the multi-race horizontals, unless you really have strong opinions in multiple legs. I mean, that to me is the biggest case against like playing a pick 5 or a pick 6 is, how many times are there going to be 5 consecutive races where you really feel confident about how to bet those races? Probably not very often. Whereas if you're playing the vertical pools, you can just pick the races that you feel good about and play them. I think that's something to keep in mind. But, the other thing is just in terms of the way you size your bets, if, you want to play a pick 5 or superfecta, just don't make that the focus of your play and use all your bankroll on that. Make that just the occasional bet a little to win a lot where you have a strong opinion. Just, don't say, all I'm going to do is play the pick 5, or all I'm going to do is play dime supers. That's probably not the best way, to the best path to long-term success.
Well, the pick 5 takes a lot of bandwidth, and it involves a lot of study, and it's something you definitely can't half-ass, right? So it's, like if you're playing it, it just doesn't make sense unless it's purely casually to just throw together a ticket without seriously handicapping all 5 races, and then also thinking about ticket construction. I mean, it is, I've been with people and probably certainly done it myself, where I'll get to the 4th race and then realize, oh my God, I like this horse a lot after looking at it more intensely, and I didn't include it in my ticket, right? So you just it's making sure that you take a deep dive into all those races, because I do think nowadays it's really more about deep dives into races to beat the teams, right? You have to the races that you're going to be successful in beating the teams at are ones the races that you really know and really know all the horses, and that's harder to do over a broader sequence.
Yeah, I agree. I think they used to say, well, it's just everything we say is kind of saying that it comes down to, if you want to compete, you really have to pick your spots, right? You have to pick the spots where you are set up for success, rather than picking up, walking into an ambush where, odds are stacked against you.
Yep. No, that's for sure. It's different game, challenging game. And again, at least with what's happening at Del Mar and NYRA, we're taking some step in the right directions. I know they're there's baby steps, but hopefully the tables will turn a little bit, uh, back in the player's favor.
But I still think you can find spots where you can have success, and it's still just as fun to handicap the races as it always was, and it's just as fun to cash the bets. It's just now it's a little harder to find, those bets you can cash, and that are plus EV, but you can still find them. Just have to maybe work a little harder and be a little more selective. But
Yeah.
you don't have to abandon the game, and you can whine and complain, but bottom line is, if you put the work in and you apply some self discipline, you still have a chance, I think.
No, I agree with that. I agree with that. It's just
And it's still a great game.
yes, it's just a different approach, a more patient approach, and again, the teams are beatable, but it's a different approach and a more patient approach.
Yeah, they're not beatable if you try to beat them by playing every pool and every race.
No, you can't
Yep.
beat them at their own game unless you
No.
take up what they're doing, right? You
No.
can't, breaking out the racing form and looking at every race and that's fun to do, and I absolutely do it. I just will do it with a different budget than if I'm trying to really do well. I mean, I love picking up the form and betting $10 on a race that without a great opinion. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, for sure. I mean, if you just want to, have fun, pull up in the form and just start playing, that's fine. But if you're really trying to beat the game, then you're going to have to continually adapt. And now the thing you have to adapt to the most is the impact of these teams. And it's not easy, but it's not impossible.
No,
But that's part of the game that makes it fun. It is always changing. You're never going to be able to just figure out the secret and sit on it for the rest of your life. That just doesn't happen. You have to evolve.
no, and that's true in pretty much everything, right? Is the evolution is a natural process that occurs, and markets get more efficient, and so again, it's a different game than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and it'll be different in 10 years from now.
Yeah. And part of the problem with the racing industry is it hasn't been adapting to all the changes in the betting landscape and the entertainment landscape, and it's dying as a result. It's slowly contracting in any way you measure it. So that's unfortunate, but maybe it's not too late even for the racing industry to turn it around. And I think one of the ways they can do that is to focus on the betting side, which they seem to, just ignore, and which makes no sense at all.
No, it doesn't, and again, we can only hope they will. It does, look, it's hard to be for things like, it's hard to be against things like decoupling when when players often are ignored, right? And so if decoupling may cripple racing, but at least it'll force tracks to focus on their customers, right? And I think they sometimes forget who their customers are.
Yeah, I mean, it's a double-edged sword, right? It was absolutely a double-edged sword. This, getting slot revenues, it certainly helped in terms of bringing revenue in to increase purses, but it shifted the focus of the racetracks completely away from their customers to just making sure they can maintain or increase, that subsidy, and that long term, I think it's just been a net negative, unfortunately, and we've seen that through all this contraction. And I don't see any stop to it unless the mindset changes.
Yeah, no, the contraction is very sad. So hopefully, hopefully things will turn, and hopefully things will turn. Things will turn for the player. Hopefully we'll get some momentum that will momentum that will change the game for the better, bring back casual players, bring back more of our middle market players who've left. It's hard to see, but hard to see, and a lot of things are going against that. But I don't know. There's some signs of life there.
Yeah, and there's always going to be racing. I mean, it just may not look quite like it does today, and there might be far fewer tracks, but there'll always be racing.
Yep.
Um, but it's just, for those of us who have been playing for a long time, maybe not all the way back to 1968, it might have been the zenith, but it was pretty good going in the, you know, 70s and 80s, even 90s was still pretty good. And it's just it's hard to see, compare what we have now to what we had then. But
Well,
that's
yeah,
part of life, right? It changes.
I mean, it's remarkable to be able to wake up and bet races, from Europe in the morning and horse racing and harness racing all day, and then Australia, at night. So that is remarkable to be able to do. But I mean, in the U.S., it used to be Wednesday through Sunday there was great racing, and now it's really only Saturdays, and it's so depressing. Like Thursdays are now pretty much dead. And so, anyway, I don't know that we'll get back to that. Sometimes maybe less is more. In the dog industry, there are two dog tracks left, and each of those dog tracks, and the two dog tracks handled $400 million last year. So sometimes less is more. But the fact that the regional tracks are disappearing, and that we have fewer and fewer good racing days, smaller fields is also hurts the recreational player, and hurts the pen and paper player.
Yeah, and it makes it tougher to keep not only to hold on the players you've got, but to keep the pipeline of new players coming in when there's no local tracks or anything. It's harder to get that initial engagement going.
Yeah, no.
So, but anyway, let's not. Well, I don't want to end on a down note. I want to end on the up note. The up note is, I do think that you can still win at this game if you really want to, if you enjoy it, and if you're willing to put the time in. But it's changing, and you have to change with it. And the big change now, is the computer assisted wagering, CAWs, and the big teams, and you just got to acknowledge that and try to adapt. And I think you can. Hopefully, the industry will better manage it, right? And some of the ideas that you talked about are great ones, and they are starting to do a little bit, but there are a lot more needs to be done. And there are models for managing better. I mean, you talked about Hong Kong. That's where these teams got started. That's where the Bentner built his models and used his models to make a lot of money. But they're certainly active in those pools, but they've done some things to mitigate the impacts and help players. So it's not like it can't be done. It can't be better managed. And there are real life examples in other racing jurisdictions that U.S. racing could use as a model. So I'm not totally hopeless that maybe the industry will adapt at some point. Maybe that's foolish given their track record, but I think the potential's there. And some people will probably shoot me, and I think you agree with me on this, is that we could still have the teams in the pools and still have a fairly healthy, thriving betting ecosystem if it's better managed.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, and I think the fact that the public outcry is what turned Del Mar. I think it's important to keep the pressure up. I think it's important to, the more information we get, the better, right? And the more this is discussed, I think that in some ways, like if you look at the Hong Kong broadcast, they talk quite a bit about the direction the money's moving in. What's happening with the prices. They put different, symbols up to indicate prices are moving. You watch the Australian broadcast, they talk about market movers, right? And I think that has to be, part of what we talk about. I think that there, in some ways, we don't want they're not talked about on the air and they're not talked about in broadcast because I think that the tracks would rather that most people know that most people think that teams don't exist or know nothing about the fact that they're competing against computers. But I think it's important that we go the other direction. And even to that point, it's important that we get tools that allow us to compete effectively in this changing market, that we adapt to the fact that the teams represent a change in the way handicapping is done. And hopefully there'll be more tools out there. I believe that they're going to be more tools available to allow regular players to compete and have some of the same abilities to build tickets that the teams do. So again, I'm excited about what that offers.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. That's one of the places I want to spend some time is try to help develop some of those tools for players because I do think there's an opportunity there to help players, have a better chance to compete, and just take some people to step up and make it happen, right? So, I totally agree with you in that regard. All right, anything else you want to add? We've been talking for a long time. Time flies, I always say, but you're probably spent. But I really appreciate it. I mean, this has been great. Anything else you want to add before we wrap it up?
No, I think we nailed a lot of it. And again, I appreciate you having me on, and I'm working on some more studies. I've got this great data set that goes all the way back to October of 2021, looking at all the basically all the odd cycles at a bunch of different racetracks, and hopefully I'll have a couple more papers out. And just get a clearer idea of what's going on at these different tracks, and hopefully help institute some changes. But I appreciate you having on, and always enjoy talking horse racing with you, and glad I was both the inaugural and then the 50th guest
That's right.
on your podcast.
Yes, you were. Yeah, 2 milestones, and you helped me initially on that first podcast, kind of getting started. That was number one. So I always appreciate that. And, I appreciate what you're doing in terms of trying to dig into the data, and because that's what we lack. So that my frustration is that it's just so opaque in terms of what's going on. And it's really hard to figure out how to fix a problem when you have no data. And so anything you can do in that regard will be great. So looking forward to anything else you come up with. I want to say thank you for spending the time. Thanks for the listeners, those of you who made it to the end here. Thank you for sticking around for part 2 of this 2-part podcast. And good luck out there. Don't give up. Keep fighting the good fight. You can be successful. So may you boldly go where no horse player has gone before.